So welcome to Bodhicitta Dakini Monastery. And today's talk, we're talking about integrating the shadow, which seems relevant with everything that's going on in this world right now. We all have trials and tribulations, and these are a necessary part of getting insight into ourselves, because only showing the good parts of ourselves pushes our unresolved issues into the subconscious, and they're suppressed. And often we're wearing masks and we're unable to process real feelings and challenges, and this makes us, those who suffer more openly, feel alone, that they're the only people struggling to survive with the challenges that all human beings face. So this can create unrealistic standards, and it can also create depression. And there is a lot of this, especially with comparing ourselves on social media, like, I don't have this, and why they have it together, their lives look good, why don't I? When really a lot of what we call society is, a facade of what's really going on underneath, which is something much more complex. Sometimes we feel what is in us is socially unacceptable, and we create a fake self, a persona, to be acceptable to others, basically. And we are ashamed of the parts of ourselves that we don't think others will embrace, and we push those down. But that can negatively affect our whole life, and we become inauthentic. And then when we reach middle age, we kind of are unable to, because we haven't been processing, this is some people, obviously not everyone, all of this stuff we've been pushing down becomes harder and harder to have festering there without processing these difficult trauma and emotions. And they come up, and we face challenges, and then we can no longer maintain the farce, and our persona falls away. And this is why we have a need to face our darkness, because if we don't face our darkness, that will unconsciously control a lot of what we do and feed into what we do. Whereas if we take responsibility, we are conscious about how we're acting and what we're projecting. And we're actually, someone who is in touch with their darkness is actually empowered and powerful, in the sense, not in the sense of like being controlled by it, but being aware that this is stuff I need to work with and process before I let it out, before I let out this, undealt with energy, basically. But otherwise, if they haven't dealt with it, it can start to seep into everything that they do. And that kind of explains a lot of the violence in the world. A lot of it is unresolved darkness. And if you light a match, you cast a shadow. There is no light without the dark. There is no lotus without the mud. There is no rose without the compost. And all of us have this. So one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious, said, I believe it was Jung. The things we deny and that we don't wish are in our unconscious. And we're all capable of good and bad. It's what we choose to act on that makes us good or bad. We obviously need restraint. We need to restrain our unwholesome tendencies, or it can create a lot of suffering for us. But ultimately, we need to examine and look at the darkness and the rage and the fear and the anxiety that can make us act unskillfully in the world. We need to get to the root of that, rather than just pretending it doesn't exist. Yeah, so the shadow is not dangerous unless repressed. It's actually untapped capacity. For example, the shy person may be assertive, has the capacity for assertiveness. Our rage has the capacity to become empathy and compassion if worked within the right way. It's energy. You know, there's a lot of energy tied up in desire, in anger. This is actually a basic Vajrayana principle that, you know, what is considered unwholesome or raw, unprocessed can become transformed. There's a lot of energy wrapped up in unconscious tendencies. So these can become our allies, can become a powerhouse of insight. Yeah. Also, if we ignore the shadow, we're often needing to project our dark side onto others to avoid taking responsibility for our actions. Like the yes or no referendum. You know, we don't want to take responsibility for our actions, for our history, so we vote no. Yeah, so the collective shadow leads to war, strikes, genocide, and strife. So until we acknowledge our shadow, we don't have self-awareness, we don't have radical honesty, we don't have real connection with each other because we're not showing who we really are and what we're really struggling with. There is actually something very brave in vulnerability, and real love has to be based on vulnerability and trust and dealing with who we actually are and what we're actually dealing with and our shared struggle and our shared humanity. When we can hold space for our own suffering, for our, you know, and when we work with our own raw energies, our capacity, our resilience to hold space for the suffering of others and the darkness of others also increases. And we become like the wounded healer. We become able to offer transformation. Yeah. The wounded healer is at home in darkness. So there is this idea that we basically modern culture is a constant quest for self-improvement and unrealistic standards. And we're all, because materialism is quite empty of meaning. You know, you get a basic standard of living and then you're like, wow, this is kind of boring, you know, like what else is there? And instead of building meaningful community and altruism and relationships and, you know, craft or like skills, we just have this kind of empty consumer culture, which leaves us feeling a bit numb. And you know, a lot of us, like, there is an epidemic of depression, and also just, I mean, it's kind of depressing when you look at the kind of fads of society, like, you know, like the point of my life is to lose weight and I can't love myself until I lose weight, or I need to look 15 years younger than I actually am, or I need to get muscly, otherwise I won't find a partner, or I don't know, I need a big house, or otherwise I'm not a man, you know, or I need to look a certain way, or otherwise I won't be considered, you know, feminine. Just all these things that we impose on ourselves, and we torture ourselves, the standards of others we try to fit into. Of course, there are those of us who move away from the mainstream and become happy in our own skin and don't conform. That's also an alternative. But even within the alternative scene, there is a challenge to stay motivated, to stay inspired, to stay connected. There can be a lot of dysfunctional dynamics, even like we reject mainstream society, but we still develop a lot of problems within, you know, alternate circles. Our problems reflect, even in monasteries and, you know, spiritual circles and leftist circles, the power dynamics and the interpersonal relationships and the dysfunction often, and the abuse often reflects the larger society, the larger dysfunction, because we're still carrying the unresolved seeds of society in us and our relational dysfunction. Yeah, so don't cure depression. Learn to be with it. Learn to be with, unless you have like a chemical imbalance in your brain, in which case you might need medication and therapy. But a situational depression, I mean, looking at our society, it could be natural to feel depressed, to just be working in a job you hate and feel disconnected from people around you, and to be constantly told you're not good enough because you don't meet certain standards. It's enough to make any normal person depressed. Like, I think it's Gabor Mate, he said, it's no, or was it Krishnamurti? I can't remember. It's no strange thing to be depressed in a society that is maladjusted, basically. But if we are to be whole, we need to have a dark side. We need to, and the darkness is also not knowing. It's also rest. When you sometimes can't find an answer and you just hand it over to the womb of time, to the fullness of time, and you mull it over, like you're mulling it over in the darkness, in the roots, like in wintertime, the animals go into hibernation. We all need those natural periods of time where we just mull over something unconsciously, and where we learn something in a very intuitive way. We just hand it over to, the Christians would say we hand it over to God, but it's an unconscious knowing. We give ourselves time to rest. And it's also the union of opposites that gives us wholeness. And in every song there are high and low notes. You don't just throw away the low notes, because they complement the high notes. Without one, there is not the other. So suppressing the shadow is living in a state of enforced ignorance. And the world should be a place where there is curiosity, where we look at moral imperatives, that show us how to end our suffering. If we don't examine our own darkness and our communal darkness, and that also means examining truthfully history and what we've done, our actions and our intentions will not align, because we're doing a bypass. We're doing a bypass of what has led us to the present, and what our capacity for violence or evil and goodness are. The most dangerous person, in fact, is the one who has not examined their darkness, who thinks they're good but is controlled by their own denial. Because in a state of denial, in a state of disassociation, this is what happens in cults. People have to go into a disassociated state, because to examine the pain of the present, of what is going on, people become so desperate for love and approval that they will disassociate and abandon their own well-being and become controlled by others, basically, to keep that one relationship, which is so similar to the original bonding you have with a father figure or a parent or a mother figure. And so that is why the person who is disassociated from their own darkness, from their own power, from their own truth, is so easy to manipulate, and probably does the most terrible atrocities. Yeah, and being disassociated, being not in touch with your own wealth of the things you have to work with. It's like not a garden without compost, a spinner without wool. It's being disassociated from your dreams, from your aspirations. If you're giving up your pain and your challenges, you're also giving up your dreams and your desires and your inspiration and your profound transformation, your curiosity. And you will also have like a sense of mental fatigue. So, yeah. Sometimes the status quo, it puts forth this idea that that numbness, or this kind of societal lie that we have, that everything's okay, that these terrible things aren't going on, that we're really decent people, and that this disassociated state, or this denial, this level of denial, is common sense or rationalism or utilitarian for the benefit of the many. And that's how they justify, genocide and white supremacy and racism and patriarchy, for the good of the many at the expense of the few. But often, ultimately, the price is our hearts and souls and our conscience. And we have to maintain this lie at any cost, because to examine the level of historical male violence or white supremacy, or the violence of one religion against another, is to be humbled and is to feel pain. And we want to protect ourselves from pain at any cost. But that is also our fullness, our humanity, our love, our capacity to feel is tied up in that as well. And that's why bell hooks said the first casualty of patriarchy is men's, like, they must psychically sever from their humanity. So the price of that kind of, and the same with white supremacy, your capacity to see another human being as another human being. Instead, you must view them as other. You must view them as other to commit atrocities and oppress them, and so the psychic severance of our humanity is a very high price to pay to maintain that level of denial. And the shadow is a narrow door. If we are unconscious, unaware, then we're not free. And by bearing it, we become controlled by it. Our everyday existence becomes all about denying. Like there are some men so heavily invested in denying historical violence against women and violence that's still happening. There's many white people heavily invested in denying everything that's gone on with Indigenous people and racism. There are straight people heavily invested in, and there is often sometimes gay people who are in the closet heavily invested in maintaining the gender rigidity, or policing masculinity. Like, even a man cries or shows vulnerability and they're ridiculed. That rigid masculinity is policed in such a toxic way, and it harms everybody. Yeah. So in keeping these things suppressed, we actually become controlled by it. Yeah. So this darkness, to become whole, we need to examine our biases, our trauma, all the things we would like to hide from others. But we need to bring it out, because our creativity, our humanity is wrapped up in that. And there's a lot of gold there. It just needs to be kind of brought into the light and examined, and gradually what is not useful can be turned, laid back into the earth and, turned into good compost. In the darkness, there is also strength. Rather than suppressing or acting out, we need to be mindful. because this living in this unconscious way is extremely violent to ourselves and to others. It brings about depression, it brings about numbness, it brings about inhumanity and atrocities and unhappiness. You know, in the very least, it brings out unhappiness. Only by examining our darkness, examining our trauma, examining our biases can we become whole, can we become truly healed, and can we make peace with the past. Because no one said, though we say examine the darkness or it will control you, the real work of bringing that stuff to light means difficult conversations, means acknowledging what we're capable of and the things that we've done and the things that we could do. But that's real goodness. Real goodness is being honest about what you're capable of and not doing it, or making peace with the fact that you did it and not doing it again. It's not pretending that you've never done it and you will never do it. And that's why there's this kind of rage that happens when people speak about child abuse. There's so much denial and so much aggression towards the people who say this actually happened. And it's also the same with, you know, any kind of violence, really. If you speak to the dominant culture, to the people invested in maintaining this idea that these things didn't happen and that the basis of their prosperity is land theft and violence and genocide and whatever, you know, the ugly things underneath their supremacy, if you are the one who speaks truth to power, you will be hated and you'll be suppressed and you will experience a real backlash, because the whole status quo of the majority is based on the denial of those things. But these things eat into society, eat into our psyches, and just mean that these things will happen again and again until we really, really understand and make peace with the darkness that created these things in the beginning. Only by, like people say, examine history, and you know, those who don't examine history are doomed to make the same mistake again. But we often know these things happen, but we don't know in detail, and we haven't really felt it. We haven't really fully understood what those atrocities mean and what othering means and what supremacy of any kind, where you're dehumanizing nature or animals or each other, you know, and the true violence of that. So this is the journey of the spiritual warrior. This is the journey of accountability, of being a true, this is what makes you a real elder of any community, is when you've actually owned what you've done and what you're capable of doing, and made amends. You know, that's why when apartheid ended in South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was so, that practice was very profound, when people could just be heard and speak about, this is what reconciliation means. You know, it means difficult truth-telling, difficult conversations. And those things come out now and then, but then they usually, you know, just go back under the carpet and we go back into denial. There's a lot of things we need to have conversations about and feel before we can heal those things. And until we have conversations about and feel those things, they will continue to dog us and dog our every move for reconciliation, for healing, for peace between men and women, peace between families, peace between nations. It's so necessary. If we could hear each other, if we could practice deep listening, we would heal so very much. And even beginning by hearing ourselves, hearing our own inner child, the things that have happened to us, the the slights and, the 1,000 paper cuts of being human. We have to start with listening to the prisoners of our own heart. The prisoners of our own heart are a bit like the convicts in the First Fleet, stuffed below deck. And we like to pretend they're not there, but they're there. And we just need to invite them up for a cup of tea. They won't mutiny if we give them a cup of tea and hear them out. They'll probably start leaving of their own accord. When you have a very unpleasant guest and you just don't feed into what they're saying because they almost want you to, they're baiting you. They want you to react. If you just sit with them and give them a cup of tea and listen, okay, this is going on for you. And in this situation, what do you think the best thing we can do is? And then eventually they feel heard, they feel validated, and they can put it down. They can put down the burden of what they've been carrying and be liberated. This is what we need to do with the prisoners of the heart. This is what we need to do with our brutal history, and with our inequality and the ways in which we oppress each other. This is what we need to do in our relationship to ourselves, to our loved ones, and to the earth. And this is how we can heal. And this is how the darkness becomes the fertile soil of deep understanding and powerful alchemy and creativity and joy. And this is how we can really see each other and celebrate each other and honor each other, and no longer be ashamed. Yeah. So that is my talk on bringing the darkness to light and healing, violence, the violence of patriarchy, the violence of materialism, the violence of white supremacy. Do you have any questions before we end, or?
No. All of what you're saying is all very, it's all very true and very relevant to now. But I always think about what is at the very root cause of all this. And something I've been thinking of for the last few months is the term dukkha, but not the English translation of dukkha. What did dukkha mean 2,500 years ago to the Sakyamuni Buddha? What did it mean in their language of northern India? It's that thirst, striving. It's that thing that makes you want to reach and grab hold of things. So if you're able to then let those go, some of those dark things can go away too.
This is true. Isn't it ill at ease?
Ill at
Dis-ease.
Dis-ease, disquiet, discontent. It's not necessarily suffering. The English translation.
Ill-being.
Ill-being.
Yeah.
So it's that whole concept. So if you can, as we are now, let's say it's very